Hey guys, welcome to Final Fantasy 15 Dawn of the Future, Part 2. We are in episode Ardyn, or as it is known in the book, A Savior Lost. Um, in modern era 734. So, if you recall from the DLC, it's about time for Ardyn to wreck some shit. So, without further ado, let's have Ardyn wreck some shit. ME 734. His driver was not a particularly talkative man. It struck him as unusual. Most taxi drivers chattered on incessantly from the moment you entered the car, as if afraid to let you get another word in once you'd given your destination. The passenger ended up spending the ride with his mouth shut out of necessity, not out of volition. In other news, because this driver was of so few words, Ardyn could hear the radio broadcast in perfect, uninterrupted clarity. A member of the Border Patrol has been reported MIA since some time before dawn this morning. It was a mildly inconvenient time for this particular story to break. Ardyn decided a bit of prudence might be wise. Men with guarded tongues often boasted sharp ears. The missing officer has been identified as 28-year-old Mars Sapientia. He rubbed the tiny splatter of blood on the ID badge on his chest. For such men, sometimes it was not only their ears that were sharp. Ardyn briefly considered keeping a hand over the name on his badge for the remainder of the ride. Perhaps he could cross his arms and keep a badge concealed with that casual gesture. In the end, he did not try. A person's memory was a fickle thing, plagued by uncertainties. Ardyn knew that better than any. A name repeated over the radio would be gone from a listener's mind in minutes. No, an awkward attempt at concealing the badge would draw more attention than not. Although Officer Sapientia allegedly reported for duty at his appointed time, fellow officers say he disappeared soon after and has not been sighted since. At the reporter's last line, he wanted to laugh, but carefully held back. The Border Patrol could search all they wanted. They'd not find their poor officer. The real owner of the guise he now wore had been a demon for hours. Mars Sapientia no longer existed as a human. Ardyn did not remember when he'd found himself capable of this particular trick, or how, but over time, adopting the appearance of others had become second nature to him. Maintaining the guise of Officer Sapientia was no particular strain, and it was something he intended to keep up for the duration of the day's events. Should he happen to run into any of the officer's acquaintances, the knowledge he'd gained from the man as he transferred the scourge would keep the secret safe. Even Mars's closest friends wouldn't be able to see through the ruse. Ardyn knew everything about him, down to the tiniest quirks. Suddenly there was light, as the car came out of the long tunnel into the sunlit city. Ardyn grimaced slightly and turned away from the window. He normally took great pains to keep the sunlight from his skin, but the typical uniform of the Border Patrol left his face exposed. Well, that wasn't quite right. A regulation face guard would have been standard with the uniform, but it would have seemed rather conspicuous choice inside the taxi. Ardyn leaned forward, pretending to be absorbed in the sights of insomnia straight ahead, and in doing so, kept himself that much farther from the window in the rays that streamed in. He'd not walked the streets of Insomnia before, but he knew the city well, its layout absorbed bit by bit with each soldier of Lucis who fell at his hands. Most men in the Border Patrol had set foot here at some point, and among Ardyn's informants, there was even a man who had once been granted an audience with King Mors. Others had fought on the front lines under the command of Crown Prince Regis, or rather, King Regis. Mors had passed some 5 years ago, and it was Regis who now sat the throne. Ardyn smiled at the irony. He perhaps knew more about Crown City and its doings than any of the kingdom's residents. "What about you?" It was the driver's voice that interrupted his reverie. The man's words took a moment to register. "Shouldn't you be looking for your buddy?" Of course, the missing soldier. So the driver had been paying attention to the radio broadcast after all. He'd failed, however, to notice the name on Ardyn's badge. Typical. "Oh no," Ardyn replied casually. "I'm on special assignment." The taxi was already cruising through downtown Insomnia. This seemed as good a spot as any. "Pull up over there, if you would." No sooner was the door open than he found himself plunged into the bustle of the city. There was laughter, faint strains of music, the sound of cars rushing this way and that. Ardyn climbed out. The sunlight stung. It was a revoltingly fine day. Home, sweet home, at last. 2,000 years. Not a trace remained of anything he'd ever known. Gone were the golden fields of wheat, the birdsong, and the smell of soil carried upon the breeze. Instead, he saw skyscrapers and streets of gray, lined by rows of trees spaced with artificial precision, and everywhere the kingdom's banners flew overhead. So this is the city Somnus built, he mused to himself. People thronged the roads and the plazas, eagerly celebrating the founding of his brother's kingdom, built on the back of his own flesh and blood. So, I mean, I guess I need to take an addendum here and say, I guess Somnus really did build Insomnia right smack dab where everything happened. I was always kind of under the impression that they moved a little bit, but no skin off my back. So I guess I was wrong. All around those were him caught up in the atmosphere of revelry, spirits high, so oblivious to the truth of their homeland. Everything they knew and cherished was built atop a foundation of lies and betrayal. How little they knew of their history. How little they knew of anything. Just look at them, free of care and unaware of the war beyond their wall, he sniffed. What need is there to worry when brick and mortar blind them to the suffering outside? Surely the residents of the district of Galad and Kavana had once thought the same. Never had they imagined a day might come when their happy home would no longer be protected by the wall. Yet, 9 years ago, the barrier keeping Lucius's enemies at bay was scaled back to the ramparts of the crown city, and Galad enjoyed the protection of the wall no more. Demise was ever a swift thing. It might arrive without warning, yet even if there were signs, no one paid them heed. The creature known as man was all too eager to avert his eyes from the unpleasant. Trapped within these walls, they cannot even see how wide the world truly is. Beneath this sliver of blue crowded by skyscrapers, the citizens of Insomnia chattered away with empty heads. They'd never known hunger. They'd never known cold. They hadn't even faced the terror of disease. They were fools to the last, and nary a thought had entered their minds beyond where they might turn for their next moment of excitement, their next length. What a dismal existence. Amid the laughter and music came a chirp of a loudspeaker. Welcome to the Founders' Day Festival. In a moment, the parade will begin making its way through the city. Ardyn smiled. He'd show them something more exciting than a rank after rank marching down the streets. Soon the whole city would dance in red, a garland of flames for every man, woman, and child. Together, they would celebrate Insomnia's design. Now let the fireworks begin! His right hand shot into the air to summon forth Ifrit, god of fire. Soon fear would fill the entire city. The Infernian would be a storybook myth no longer. The people would stare upon the god with their own eyes, and then they would tremble and scatter in glorious panic. Yet nothing happened. The citizens around him continued their merriment, vapid expressions intact. Oh dear, Ardyn mumbled. In fact, no one had even paid his now embarrassing display the slightest attention. Well, almost no one. There was a single small child staring at him, a look of confusion on her face as Ardyn stood with arms still upstretched. That's odd. Ardyn tilted his head, but the mystery was soon solved. A chorus of screams arose, but from a wholly unexpected direction. The ground rumbled in the distance, and when he heard the shattering of glass and shriek of twisting metal coming from buildings nearing collapse. From a side street in the distance licked tongues of unearthly flame. And then the pyre burner was there, on the grand boulevard for all to see, fire curling around his colossal form and the massive blade he wielded in one hand. Oh, cursed be the wavering whims of the gods, he moaned. Though a demon under Ardyn's control, the astral yet managed to carry out commands only in the ways he saw fit. He refused to come obediently when summoned, and seemed always a wild stallion, ready to throw off the reins and run mad at the slightest opportunity. Oops, Ardyn said, jumping to one side. Jagged bits of rubble pierced the spot where he'd just stood. The Infernian continued to attack whatever portion of the city was closest at hand. The demon god seemed wholly unconcerned as to whether the wreckage would fly in Ardyn's direction. Tides of flame surged across road and plaza, charring black anyone whose flight was not sufficiently swift. Shrieks of panic no longer filled the air. Now Ardyn listened to the agony of death. Anyone near enough to hear was either forever silenced, or soon to be too. Now then, he said, it would seem the Infernian has things taken care of over here. Ardyn proceeded down the boulevard, opposite the path of the fleeing citizens, mentally listing off the next steps to take. His to-do list distressingly long. Ah, I almost forgot. He turned and caught sight of a stalwart member of the Crown's Guard, doing his best to stay his own hysteria and direct the flow of panicked citizens. Ardyn flagged the man down, asking, Could I borrow that? The man's look of disbelief was soon replaced with anguish as his body collapsed to the ground in a black haze. Not a soul around seemed to notice. They were all too absorbed in their own flight from the flames to care what happened to anyone else. Ardyn picked up the fallen soldier's radio and checked to see that it was on. Ah, so good to finally find one, he mused. Officer Sapientia had, much to Ardyn's dismay, carried a different model, one not attuned to the frequencies used within the city walls. Good. It's all coming in loud and clear. Every channel was a confusion of yelling and barked orders. It grated on his ears and also brought its own delight. Ifrit had only just arrived. It would be a while before anyone grasped the full situation, and longer still until any organized response would form. Confusion among the city's leadership was patently apparent. Do enjoy yourself, my infernal friend, he said, waving cordially. You seem to have everything well in hand here, so I'll go on ahead to prepare. Phantasmal leaps brought him easily to the top of a nearby building. From that high vantage, the extent of the inferno was easy to see. And what a wonderful sight it was. But he had other business to attend to. The memories of a certain technician, recently deceased, informed him that that elevation was key when hijacking a broadcast signal. Gigantic screens mounted throughout the city all showed a close-up of a female news anchor. Her eyes darted about nervously, but her mouth was as tight as she delivered her report. Attention all citizens. An enormous, unidentified lifeform has appeared near the Citadel. The creature has begun emitting flames, turning the area around the Citadel to a sea of fire. All citizens must evacuate immediately. I repeat, all citizens... The screens flickered black, and then the woman's words were replaced by another, deeper one. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Is this thing on? Another flicker, and now it was Officer Mars Sapientia on display throughout the city. Ah, that wasn't so difficult. Ardyn smiled to himself. It was quite amusing to see himself on screen, speaking with another's voice and likeness. It certainly made for a novel experience. Greetings, people of the Kingdom of Lucis. Do forgive me for interrupting the festivities, but I must tell you this day of rapturous revelry shall be your last. He saw one citizen stop, bewildered by these new words, only to be quickly engulfed by the flames around him. Call it divine retribution, Ardyn continued. False kings and fraudulent nations are fated to perish. The Infernian's great blade sliced through yet another building, and a cascade of rubble crushed several lives below. Ardyn smiled. Sins of the past must not go unpunished. The time of reckoning is at hand. The smell of scorched debris and burning flesh reached him on his high perch. Today marked the final day of the history of Lucis, and the first day of his retribution upon the world. Blah, blah, blah. Let me just take a sip here. Get my brain in order. So we're getting to see what Ardyn was doing while Regis was being an attractive 28-year-old and walking through the Citadel. He was 28. I did the math on it. Regis was 28 during episode Ardyn. Which means he was born when Noctis was... Noctis was born, god damn it, when he was 29, because Noctis was born next year. Iggy had just been born earlier this year, and Gladio was born a year prior. Let's see, okay, upon the world, there we go, because I was having trouble with the word upon. Well, time to set to work. I beg you, good king and people, do not struggle. It will make this far more satisfying for me. Now they would watch as he undid a nation grown vast in his 2,000-year absence, and it would take only a single day. Nay, it would take but a few hours. The screen flickered again, returning to the female anchor, her face now stricken with astonishment. That, too, would be gone soon. Either the monitors would crack and burn, or the woman herself would be charred black. It was hard to say which might come first, but that knowledge was assuredly only minutes away. Attention, all units. This is your captain speaking. Code Red. I repeat, Code Red. Follow your commander's orders and get the situation under control. One clear voice rang out amidst the turmoil on the Crown's Guard frequencies. The initial confusion seemed to have passed. Every word clear as day, Ardyn said, admiring the stolen radio. The wonders of technology. The radio chirped again. Claris here. Claris. Ardyn had heard the name somewhere before. No, he'd seen it somewhere before, among someone's stolen memories. This voice must belong to the leader of the Crown's Guard, Claris Amacitia. Have you identified the creature? Clarice asked. A subordinate replied, Not yet, but we believe it to be demonic in nature. A demon? Clarice exclaimed. But how could it possibly withstand the daylight? Why is it here now? Why? Because I summoned it, Ardyn thought, stifling a laugh. For now, help the citizens evacuate. The royal guard will take care of the giant. Absolutely, sir. He'd wanted to spend a little more time on his perch above the city, but looking down on the suffering below, but it seemed he could afford to dawdle no longer. Evacuate? Well, we can't have that now, can we? Every last subject of Lucis had to die. There could be no survivors. Yoo-hoo! Oh, Ifrit! The Infernian drew near, and Ardyn dove, plummeting back to ground level. Between the two of them, the Crown's Guard mobilizing at their current location wouldn't have a chance to reach the fleeing civilians. Slay those trained to organize the evacuation, and there wouldn't be much of an evacuation left to stop. The strokes of the pyre burner's great blade tore through the guards' ranks, leaving the better part of their numbers ablaze. My, but the god's might does inspire. He beamed as Ifrit continued to ravage soldier and city. Though I must admit, they're not much for detail work. A lucky few soldiers managed to avoid each strike, but their luck was short-lived. In the god's wake came Ardyn, who dispatched the remaining troops one by one, their movements so dull and predictable that to him they may as well have been standing still. The Crown's Guard is almost wiped out, sir. Target is still on the move. Special forces are on their way. Try to hold out until they arrive. Special forces undoubtedly referred to the Royal Guard. He'd encountered them before on Angel Guard, and again at Verstale's facility. Clad in black, with faces obscured, they were also combatants of significantly greater skill than their Crown's Guard brethren. Ardyn realized they'd be a bit of a nuisance once they arrived. He was anxious to have the rest of the fodder mopped up before that happened. No sooner were the last of the Crown's Guard units downed than several black-clad soldiers warped in. A new voice came over the radio. Engaging the target. At Ardyn's first blow, the same voice spoke again, its timbre changed. He's so strong. Ardyn heard the words twice, once with a slight delay. He realized the soldier he was hearing on the radio was the same man he was attacking just then. Sending backup, Clarice barked. Don't let him get away. But by the time the order came, the man was dead. So sorry to disappoint, Ardyn mused, but I think I've had enough of being restrained for one lifetime. He felt another enemy at his back and dodged the incoming blow without turning. Then he was circling, shadow-stepping in a great arc to get behind his assailant. Or rather, assailants. As Ardyn closed in, he realized there were several. Not that it mattered. They'd die all the same. Currently engaging the target, a reinforcement from the Crown's Guard chimed in as he reached the area. Are you quite certain you have the time to be talking right now? But the man continued to report as he and Ardyn clashed. Sir, I don't think he's one of us. See, you're leaving me all kinds of openings. And then this man, too, was dead. Not that it would have mattered if he'd stayed silent and entirely focused on the fight. The outcome would have been the same. Then what the hell is he? Clarice demanded over the radio. What am I? Ardyn thought in response. Why, I'm me. Would it have been even possible to explain? Better to leave simple minds blissfully unaware of the complexities of immortal life. Another crackle of static. Sir, we've identified the giant. It's the Infernian. Ifrit, the Infernian. An astral? My, does information flow at a leisurely pace in Lucis, Ardyn quipped. They all fought with movements heavy and cumbersome, like men flailing underwater, and it seemed their minds moved just as slowly. Yes, sir. One of our officers seems to be controlling the Infernian, but we can't get an ID on him. What? Clarice shouted. Find out who he is, at once! And to think I wish to savor their struggle, Ardyn sighed. Oh well, I suppose I can't get a legacy such as my brother's to produce the greatest minds of the day. He pummeled another man into the ground, then looked up. The battle seemed to be all but over, all enemy combatants dispatched. What an underwhelming start. He pondered where to go next. Was it better to finish off other Crown's Guard squads, doubtlessly mobilizing in sectors all over the city? Or perhaps he ought to let them organize an evacuation after all. Let them gather the entire populace in one convenient location for swift and total annihilation. Another transmission sounded, this one different from the others. There seems to be some kind of disturbance. What's going on? Ardyn checked the radio, but it was silent. He shifted to look at another device he'd brought along. An Imperial transceiver. Of course. The voice belonged to Verstale, presumably still positioned just beyond the wall. Why, whatever do you mean? Ardyn smiled as he responded. Fine, I'll not ask. Versailles said. Now, I need you to locate and destroy the devices amplifying the wall. As you wish. Just sit back and enjoy the show. If they could manage to bring down the wall, Ardyn would leave the slaughter of ordinary citizens to the Imperial army. Hard to argue with efficiency, he thought. Then aloud, now, where in the world might those dastardly devices be? He'd merely been speaking to himself, but Versailles seemed to take the question as addressed to him. I've marked the location of all the devices they're using to amplify the wall. The transceiver's screen displayed an aerial view of the city. Several red circles dotted the map. They seemed to be positioned on rooftops around the city. Find them and destroy them. With pleasure, Ardyn replied. I'll be sure to keep you abreast of my progress. Then, with the transceiver carefully muted this time, he sighed, No rest for the wicked. He examined the screen, determining the best route to reach the first device. The answer was the rooftops. Up high, he'd be able to avoid the Crownsguard grunts scrambling among the city streets. One less annoyance to deal with. He sighted the tallest building nearby and leapt with phantasmal force to the top. As he warped along, he developed a sliver of appreciation for the densely packed buildings. Down below on the city's streets, they had felt cramped and claustrophobic, but now they afforded unexpected freedom and ease in his quest to find the amplifiers. As he neared the first marked point, an unusual bit of architecture entered his view. It had to be the structure housing the amplifier. It was of elaborate design, looking somewhat akin to a small temple or pavilion, and nearly every surface was covered with intricately patterned carvings. Inside stood a stone figure, which seemed to glare from its post as Ardyn drew near. The statue seemed familiar. Ardyn recalled something resembling it in one of his many borrowed memories. The fierce, is it? Ardyn chuckled. Tonitris Lucis Caelum, one of the kings of yore. As for when, exactly, he was part of his nation's history, the borrowed memory did not say. Perhaps it was a mystery that would remain forever unsolved. In any case, what terrible taste in headgear, Ardyn shrugged, then turned to inspect the fixtures positioned at each of the structure's four corners. They seemed to be some manner of repository meant to channel magical energy. Smashing them would undoubtedly disrupt the amplifier. Ardyn moved in a circle, taking them out one by one, but his destruction of the fourth was met with an unexpected bellow. I have sworn to vanquish all who would besmirch this sacred place. The deep, booming voice came from inside the structure. When Ardyn lifted his eyes, he beheld the speaker. The great stone figure shuddered to life atop its dais, its surface glowing with otherworldly light. Oh dear, Ardyn sighed. The kingdom's defense budget is surely nothing to scoff at. He'd assumed the wall was designed exclusively to repel external assaults. After all, if no enemy could get inside the city to begin with, why bother mounting more of the crystal's defenses on the inside? It seemed a reasonable enough assumption. More importantly, not a single one of the many demonified soldiers had offered up memories suggesting otherwise. It served only to underscore how uninformed underlings always were. The details of real importance were leagues above their pay grades. A lattice of light flashed into place on every side of the rooftop. It was the same hexagonal grid of design of the wall itself, on a miniature scale. Clearly, this was meant to bar the escape of anyone who tampered with the amplifier. The stone guardian launched itself forward. It slammed its mace into a portion of the rooftop occupied by Ardyn not a split second before. Its weapon was immense. One blow would have sufficed to smash any mere human to a pulp, yet the guardian's movements were sluggish. The power of an attack meant nothing if it never connected. Ardyn would soon be victorious, and he wouldn't even have to break a sweat. All he had to do was devote a fraction of his attention to avoiding the mace. Moreover, with the Star Scourge able to infect both flesh and stone, his arsenal was as robust as ever. Whether man or statue, the Guardian's fate at Ardyn's hands would be the same. The battle did not take long. When it was over, the statue fashioned after the fierce faltered, light fading from its surface, and then the stone itself crumbled and vanished into thin air. The grid of blue light surrounding the rooftop vanished too, and Ardyn was free to move on. As he made his way, he heard more chatter from the Crownsguard radio. Sir, one of the wall amplifiers has been destroyed! The young officer's voice was panicked. Claris's response came quickly. But why would he target them? Is this a Nif attack? Goodness, Ardyn thought. You're still all the way back there? He found it hard to believe that this was the man leading the kingdom's esteemed Crownsguard. Could he be any more obtuse? We haven't sighted any Imperial soldiers inside or outside the wall, sir. Then they must have sent him to do their dirty work, Claris replied. Stop him at once. Ardyn chuckled. At least they seemed to be on the right track. He began heading towards the next marker. There were 7 amplifiers in all, but the thought of dancing the same dance 6 more times seemed a bit wearisome. At least all 7 were installed within the relative vicinity of the Citadel. It wouldn't take long to move from one to the next. The next device involved a bit more effort. This time, the Guardian of Stone was not alone. With it were several more of the Royal Guard. They were more nimble than the regular fodder, but their attacks had grown predictable. They engaged him at the same manner as when he dealt with them in the island and at Versailles' facility. "Oh, how I tire of entertaining you," he moaned. He needn't fear death at their hands, but the attacks quickly landed were admittedly painful. At their cries of fear and surprise quickly grew stale. Over and over, the same shouts of "Monster!" and "He's not human!" that he'd heard from countless mouths already. It was a bother he'd sooner avoided. Still, for all the burden they posed, the harvest was great. The Royal Guard represented the best of the best. The information they had access to was beyond that of the normal troops. A captain amongst them might even sit in the occasional briefing about the most sensitive of topics. The memories Ardyn gained this time around included several terms he'd neither read nor heard before. Most interesting. It seems they've another line of defense waiting to deploy. The Wall of Lucis and its efficacy at deflecting invasion was known far and wide. This new bit of information seemed to be about another capability. The Old Wall, they called it. A wall in name, perhaps, but in function it seemed something else entirely. "In times of crisis, they call upon the kings of yore to come to their aid," Ardyn hummed, in mock admiration. Bless their souls. So the ancient kings lay in wait, ready to defend the land. When things looked dire, they'd materialize to drive Lucius's enemies away. Of course, the information provided by the memory was second-hand. Even the king's personal guard seemed to know little about the old wall, and the now demonified soldier hadn't actually seen it. Perhaps no one had. Perhaps it hadn't been activated in ages. Still, the information seemed detailed enough to trust. "If they summon the old wall, perhaps I'll see that long-lost brother of mine." His body shivered with delight at the unimagined possibility. Somnus was dead. Therefore, there was no hope of confronting him directly. Ardyn had come to accept the destruction of Somnus's line and nation as poor consolation, but now this was the chance to get what he truly wanted. If his brother's spirit could be called forth, it could be crushed. He could crush it. Ardyn looked down at his outstretched hands. With these very hands, he might yet kill Somnus. Strength and glee filled his body anew. He leapt from rooftop to rooftop, his new objective clear. Bring the kingdom to the brink of collapse, and thereby create a crisis ripe for the old wall to intervene. "He's going after the wall amplifier, sir." "He took out another one?" Clarice responded. "I'll station reinforcements around the amplifiers." "Sir," the underling replied. As Ardyn obliterated each subsequent guardian and operative, the messages between members of the kingdom's guard continued to flow. Each victory inched him closer to his goal. How many devices were left? While contacting Versailles, he counted out on his fingers the number of towers he'd vanquished thus far. "Are you there? Can you hear me?" Ardyn spoke into the transceiver. "Almost done. How does it look?" The Empire's plan had been simple. Disable the wall from the inside, then launch a general attack with the Imperial infantry. Ardyn's part seemed to be nearing completion. "Quite promising," Versailles' response came. "We should be able to break through the barrier with a well-timed assault. You ought to evacuate, lest you get caught in the crossfire." Meanwhile, another statue had lurched to life, and Ardyn was engaged in another fight. "Yes, but there's something I must attend to first," he said into their transceiver as the combat raged on. Once this guardian was laid to rest, it was time to see the old wall summoned. And to do that, he'd need to pay a special visit to someone. "I've got a king to kill," he announced to Versailles. "What?" The chief's tone grew shrill. "That wasn't part of the plan." "I've finished my work. Now it's time to play." "But we—" Ardyn cut him off. "No buts. You just stick to your plan and keep the boys in black busy for me." He cut the transmission and silenced the device. The infantry could manage the destruction of Insomnia and the massacre of its citizens. Ardyn had a new priority. "Yes," he crooned to himself. "It's time to play." So that was the cutscene that I accidentally missed when I opened the menu too quickly. Let me take a quick drink. There's no breaks in this, so. He dove down to the rows of trees lining the roads below, then hopped from one to the next, humming as he went, ripping banners and snapping flagpoles of Founders' Day decorations as he encountered along the way. Rubbish, all of it. A nearby loudspeaker blared a single word over and over. Evacuate! Evacuate! He smashed it to silence, and he Don't worry, I do this all the time when I mess up. Unique New York. Okay. He smashed it to silence its inane parroting. His earlier time spent thinning the Crown's Guard's numbers had paid off in spades. There was hardly a soul in sight. No one would challenge him or slow his own little festival of destruction. Such a mess, he laughed. Whoever is going to clean it up? The answer, he mused, was no one. From this day forth, Insomnia would be a ghost town. There would be nothing left to maintain. Oh, well, there's a fucking break. Really? I didn't think that there was. Oh, as I take a quick break, I have to say, I love this concept art for episode Ardyn that's on screen right now. I just realized I didn't even use the tornado ability. It's not really necessary. The sniper ability was fucking stupid. Oh my, what big walls you have, Ardyn said, standing at the front gates of the citadel. All the better to look down upon his enslaved subjects from. Not a guard was in sight. It would have been unthinkable at any other time but for the chaos. Every free hand, and then some, was needed to attempt to stay the Infernian and organize the civilization evacuation. Priorities, priorities, Ardyn chuckled. This is what you get when the men you command can't even stop to think for themselves. He pushed through the gates and strode into the large, unobstructed courtyard that led up to the citadel proper. A glance was enough to see that it wasn't only the gates that were unmanned. The citadel's entire guard detail had been dispatched somewhere. Time to call in a favor with the king and have him summon my beloved brother, he said, making his way across the courtyard. Just then, someone emerged from the citadel doors. Ardyn made no effort to turn or flee. He was but a simple soldier on duty. His presence wouldn't invite the slightest suspicion, or so he thought. Something wrong, officer. The tone was sharp, as was the stare. As the speaker drew close, Ardyn recognized him. Ah, you must be His Majesty. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, the man replied, but the implication of his tone was clear. I don't know you, and I don't trust you. Numerous memories had featured this face and the gentle smile it was apparently known to wear. Others showed it bearing solemn dignity well beyond its years. But not one soldier of the kingdom, or at least none of those into whose minds Ardyn had delved, had been forced to confront the monarch he saw now, a man with a cutting gaze, ready to do away with any opponent. Why are you here? The king demanded. As the 113th of his line, undoubtedly not but a trace of Somnus's blood flowed through his veins. Little of him reminded Ardyn of his brother, but details be damned. This man, Regis, was a king of Lucis, and that alone was enough reason for him to die. Why, for you, Ardyn declared. His crimson arms flickered through the air, headed straight for Regis, the apparitional arsenal of their shared heritage. This was the proper means to kill a man of Somnus's line. Don't know where I got seasonal from. Regis's own blue blades were instantly summoned forth in response. The two men stood like that for a brief moment. Ardyn's weapons at Regis's throat, Regis's at Ardyn's. The royal arms? Who are you? The clash had undoubtedly unnerved Regis. Set against the king was his own power. The spectral weapons bestowed by the gods, subject to the command of House Kylum alone. Only those born to the royal family could wield them, or the trusted individuals to whom they imparted a portion of that power. And now here stood a common soldier, unidentified and wielding the arms of kings. Yet those of the royal house should at least be somewhat aware of the ancient truth they'd carefully wrapped away in lies. You ought to know, Ardyn taunted, being a man of royal blood yourself. Adagium! As Ardyn anticipated, Regis had immediately understood, drawing from memory the name of the monster entombed on Angel Guard. There was no one left but the kingdom who knew the name Ardyn Lucis Caelum, but Adagium they did know. What cruel irony that Niflheim would now stand closer to the truth of that ancient era than Lucis itself. Whether or not Lucis knew the truth of its own history, it would suffer all the same, but it would bring Ardyn greater pleasure if they understood by whose hand their end had come. "In the flesh," Ardyn replied with a chuckle, "here to bring the bloodline of Lucis to an end. Hear me, Adagium. On my honor as king, I will vanquish you." "Oh dear, what an awful thing to say to your own flesh and blood." The royal arms still hung in the air, each set of weapons straining to bite flesh, but stayed by the force of the other. Suddenly, the arrays of red and blue were dispelled, and the men turned to blade in hand to further the fight. Regis moved with speed and precision, wielding his sword with all the valor Ardyn observed in his stolen memories. The king's skill with a blade might have excelled that of Somnus himself. Ardyn could easily imagine Regis on the front lines as crown prince, alongside his men in the thick of battle. But as the king exchanged blows with Ardyn, his surprise grew apparent. "Such power!" he gasped. "Yes, I'm afraid that trait seems to have skipped a generation or two." Battling the royal guard had been a bore. The crown's guard foot soldiers were even worse. But Regis put up a proper fight. It was exhilarating. The kingly barrage would have proven fatal had Ardyn been a man of mortal flesh. Still, Regis's movements lagged just a moment behind those of his undying opponent. "This monster must be contained," the king gasped as the fight raged on. "He's too dangerous. He must be stopped." "Must I? Really? By whom, I ask?" Ardyn's body was immortal. Nothing could fell it, not even a king of Lucis. Even if he were stabbed in the chest or his throat torn out, though blood would gush forth for a moment, the ragged edges of the wounds would quickly knit together, his flesh made smooth and whole once again. But for Regis, every nick and scratch would sap his strength. Each blow landed upon him would slow him down, and in the end, no matter how great the power granted to him by the gods, his mortal body would know its limit. "What's the matter?" Ardyn smiled. "Can't keep up?" Ardyn whirled, a circling shadow of miasma, reforming behind the king. He thrust forth his hand. One sure grasp and the scourge would flow. Oh, what a pleasure it would be to turn Regis into a demon before striking him down. The king was unfortunately swift, however, and Ardyn's fingers closed on air. But although his grab may have missed, his blade struck true. It opened a gash in Regis's side, and the fight was over. Anguish filled the defeated king's eyes. "I swore to protect my people." He groaned and pressed one hand to the wound, as if he might stop the flow of blood. He staggered, and though he did not fall, neither did he manage to stand and raise his blade. "Done already?" Ardyn taunted. "But the fun's just begun." "Do you hear, dear brother?" his mind added. "The king of Lucis groans in agony. Do you see? Your scion is a wretch, brought to his knees in disgrace." Ardyn towered above Regis and issued his command. "Summon the old wall." Regis stared up in disbelief. Ardyn kicked him, and the king's bloodied body tumbled across the flagstones of the courtyard. Regis came to rest face up, his features contorted with strain, as if he were determined to lift himself back on his feet. If that was indeed his goal, the struggle was in vain. His body remained motionless on the ground. "How do you know about that?" Regis's words came in broken gasps. "I've heard the souls of kings reside within those statues," Ardyn said. "Of course, that's only hearsay. Why not summon the wall so we can see for ourselves?" Regis's hands trembled. He began to curl one into a grip, but it quickly fell limp again. It seemed the man could not summon forth the royal arms. "What I wouldn't give for a chance to speak with the founder king himself." Ardyn kicked Regis's bleeding flank once more, then shouted to the sky, "Come out, Somnus! The longer you wait, the longer he'll suffer." Nothing. Not a trace of the old wall. Not a trace of Somnus. Ardyn's anger turned savage. He kicked the downed king again, driving his heel into the man's chest. He continued until his ferocious assault had bruised every inch of Regis's body, then stepped back. Where was Somnus? Why wouldn't he appear? Was this a game to him? Perhaps he thought he was calling a bluff, certain his brother was incapable of murder. If so, he was wrong. Ardyn was a savior no longer. The kindly Lord Caelum, who was beloved by the people of his age, was no more. Huh? Regis had stopped moving. Is he dead? Ardyn wondered aloud. He bent, placing a hand on Regis's wrist to check for a pulse. Oh dear. Perhaps I don't know my own strength. And then a blinding light flared from the king's body. Ardyn stepped back involuntarily. It was the ring. That same ring, now passed through generations of Somnus's line. The gift from the gods to the rulers of Lucis sat securely on the downed man's right hand. The ring's beam widened and began to trace a silhouette in the air. Ardyn's assault had worked after all. The old wall was coming to defend the king. "Well," he drawled, "I'm waiting." The spreading light took on a human shape, a towering giant clad in armor, upon which Ardyn gazed with a triumphant grin. A giant voice boomed down at him. "Brother!" "Somnus! Haven't seen you for years," Ardyn replied. 2000, in fact. The giant manifested by the ring was outfitted not unlike the Amplifier's guardians, with thick plates of armor and a giant weapon. In this case, a sword. "What's wrong, dear brother? Too afraid to put down your expensive toy and face me yourself?" he sneered. His brother acted in death as he did in life. No fair fights. Never relying on his own strength alone. "I won't let you forget what you did to me." "You were tainted," Somnus boomed. "Unfit to sit the throne. That is why the crystal rejected you." The man was a fool if he thought his words would save him. "The crystal? Is that who exiled me as a monster and erased me from the face of history?" Ardyn shouted back. "Please, brother, return to the darkness from whence you came." "Now? But I'm having so much fun. To think I'd get the pleasure of killing you myself." There was no need for further discussion. Not that there ever had been. Ardyn was not interested in any excuses his brother might wish to provide. Blades summoned forth from the armiger now rained down upon Somnus's apparition. In a distant past, Ardyn had similarly drawn his sword in anger, but back then his point had faltered, failing to pierce his brother's heart. He knew not what stayed his hand back then. It was a mistake he'd relived over and over while chained in the darkness. But here, beyond his wildest dreams, was a chance to right it. Ardyn slashed again and again at the great stone legs, then warped up high to strike at the giant's face. Each attack fed his lust. A small part of him still yearned to put fist to flesh. Would that he could take out his anger on Somnus the man, one blow at a time, until his hands were numb with fatigue. The giant stepped back in the face of Ardyn's assault. "This is preposterous. How could one so impure possess such power?" "Power from impurity," Ardyn mused. "Hardly. The strength was born of hatred. What you feel is 2,000 years of longing to see you dead by my own 2 hands. I was right to have sealed you away. You truly are a monster, brother." "Yes, a monster indeed." In life, Ardyn had ever yielded to the gods' commands. He'd been willing to give everything to aid his people. Yet only the fruits of his devotion were this inhuman power and immortal body. And with naught else left to him, those were the tools he would use to exact his revenge. Swords alone would not suffice. Let Somnus burn in the fires of retribution. Let him writhe and wail in pain. "O Infernian, lend me your strength," Ardyn intoned. "Help me burn this wretched nation to the ground." Astral hellfire enveloped Somnus. Scorching tongues of flame lapped at the giant stone figure, its limbs cracking and groaning from the sudden heat. Ardyn leapt into the air, concentrating every bit of anger and hatred he'd ever harbored into one final blow. "This is where it ends," he said as steel met stone. And then, at long last, Somnus's knees buckled, and the giant stone form was crashing to the ground, its blinding blue light diffused and fading. A great laugh erupted from Ardyn's lungs. His eyes were squeezed shut in delight. When the laughter finally subsided and his eyes were open again, he saw Somnus was no longer encased in stone. The figure on its knees before him was the brother as he'd known him 2,000 years ago. "At long last, dear brother, vengeance is mine." "The gods blessed you as their chosen," Somnus began. "The people adored you as their savior. I was neither powerful nor popular. Just envious, perhaps. I yearned desperately to be special, yet I had nothing to set me apart. Nothing at all. Until you stole it from me." Somnus lowered his gaze. "What I did to you was unforgivable, but I did it for the future of our kingdom, of our people. Our line had done everything in our power to protect our people, just as the gods bade. I was merely fulfilling my calling." "Our line? I think you meant yours. You and the 112 kings who followed. I suppose you think you've done a wonderful job carrying out the gods' bidding." He remembered Era's words. "Your devotion shall not go unnoticed. The gods will doubtless be watching over you." He and Era had been the ones to abide by the will of the gods, not Somnus. "And here I thought I was the blessed one," he spat. "But it was you all along." It was not only the throne that had been stolen from him, not just his future. Somnus had taken all that and more. Ardyn had lost everything he'd ever known. His brother's reply was soft. "I dare not ask your forgiveness, but I do ask your understanding." Ardyn's fury boiled over. "What?" he demanded. Did Somnus think he could apologize? That his words could erase the past? That he could change anything at all? "You took everything, and you ask my understanding?" The humbled request, the lowered gaze. Pathetic gestures acted out for his own sake, just like everything he'd done in his life. Now he felt remorse for his past crimes. Was he so desperate to erase the guilt that plagued him? To hell with him. Ardyn grabbed at his brother, but caught only air. Somnus's form began to dissipate at the statue's hand. "I pray your soul find repose, brother." Repose? Repose? How dare he proffer such garbage? He was the one to cause all this! He wished to hurl more words of hatred at his brother, but it was too late. Somnus was already gone. Ardyn stood alone in the city. His brother's death was supposed to be the answer. Killing Somnus was supposed to bring the relief he craved through centuries spent in solitude. But now that Somnus and his great stone puppet were toppled, Ardyn felt not even a flicker of joy in his heart. All he found inside was grave exhaustion and unbearable emptiness. Why? This wasn't the ending I imagined to my tale of vengeance. Ardyn wasn't certain how or why he had ended up back at the site of the previous battle. His mind was clouded, his body moving of its own volition. But when he looked down, Regis lay at his feet. "Of course, my revenge is not yet complete. I must end Somnus's line, destroy his legacy. Perhaps Regis's death will fill some part of this void in me." Ardyn summoned his sword, a hand tight on the grip. One quick thrust, straight into the downed man's heart, and it would be over. The king would lie dead on the stones of the courtyard. Ardyn lifted his sword overhead, poised for the killing blow. "Ardyn Lucis Caelum." An inhuman voice, awful and immense. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I command thee to halt and kneel before me." Each word was a cacophony that crashed into his mind. Ardyn pitched forward as countless towering blades rained down from above. They drove deep into the flagstones of the courtyard, forming a great circle around Regis's unconscious form. The intent was clear. No harm would come to the king. From high above came a dizzying light, and the world was washed in white. Ardyn looked towards the heavens, squinting through the glare, and beheld something of greater size, strength, and presence than he'd ever known descend upon the earth. "On my honor as the Blade Keeper, Bahamut, I shall not let thee become a slayer of kings." The Draconian, the god of war, Bahamut. Whilst the rest of the six slumbered after the great war of old, this god alone vanished to a place unknown. Why? Why do the gods deny me my revenge? As Ardyn cried out his dismay, his surroundings shifted without warning. He was no longer in the world, but suspended in some strange void. He stood, though not on ground, and in every direction he saw light the color of the night sky and the ocean depths intermingled. It was a place far removed from reality, so much that Ardyn could not think to question where. In that void, he faced the god of war. "Because thou hast been chosen to serve a different purpose. To spread darkness throughout the world is thy true calling." Calling. It was a word engraved upon his heart, but not one he'd had in mind for some time. It caught him off guard. All he could manage to do was parrot back a single word. Darkness? Soon the true king will be born unto Lucis. He shall lead the people as their beacon of hope and drive away the darkness. In turn, thou shalt be his sacrifice, the limitless shadow that ushers in the light. Why? Why must I continue to suffer? Have I not already sacrificed enough? Bahamut continued, unfazed and uninterrupted, not seeming to care whether his words were understood or not. When the true king awakens, summoning the power of his forebears, he shall at last relieve thee of thy suffering. It dawned on Ardyn that he had no need to ask. The things of which the Draconian spoke poured into his mind, played out as a moving scenes as clear as anything Ardyn had witnessed with his own 2 eyes. The birth of Regis's son, the child who would be known as Noctis, the crystal which would name that child the chosen king. Ardyn himself crossing swords with the boy grown to a young man. In the same courtyard where he'd clashed with Regis just moments ago, Ardyn would be defeated by Noctis. Noctis would sit upon the throne of Lucis and offer up his life, using the power of the ring to open the door to the beyond. The beyond. It was a mysterious realm linked to their world by way of the crystal, unreachable by mortal flesh. 2,000 years ago, Ardyn's soul had become trapped there, separated from his body, when the crystal cast him away. He thought his immortality had been granted by the star scourge that coursed through him. In truth, his spirit was trapped in the beyond, while his body remained in the mortal realm, soulless and cursed to walk the earth until the true king arrived. And when Noctis was ready, he would cross over into this realm through the power of the ring, and put Ardyn to rest once and for all. Then the line of Lucis shall come to an end, and the revenge thou seekest shall finally be found. So it is ordained, and so shall it be. Ardyn would be gone forevermore, as would Noctis, Lucis's true king and also its last. The line would end with him. And in exchange for Noctis's sacrifice, the crystal, now host to all the star scourge that had plagued the world, would shatter. Eos would be cleansed. A glimpse into a world to which light had returned flashed before Ardyn's eyes. Then it was gone, along with the Blade Keeper's other visions, and Ardyn was again in a place that was at once like the dark sky and deep sea. He stared at Bahamut. You say I am not a savior of man, but his sacrificial lamb, and that I live only to die, by the hand of the heir to an ill-begotten throne. 2 millennia ago, Ardyn had believed with all his heart that to save others was his calling. He'd been ready to embrace death, if it were in service to others and brought an end to suffering. He'd thought it a mission of which only he was capable, and thus he'd been prepared to sacrifice everything. But even at that time, he had not thought to lay down his life without struggle or fight. During his long time on Angel Guard, he'd come to think that the gods fools. They'd bestowed but a single man with the power to stop the scourge. They'd failed to imagine the crystal's rejection of the one whom they'd chosen to be king, and Ardyn had despised them for it. But now, to hear that everything that occurred was but a means to spawn a monster fit for sacrifice? It was cunning cruelty far beyond that of mortal minds. That is the fate the gods have chosen to bestow upon me? The very same. Defy thy destiny if thou dare, but know that it would grant thee a life of darkness unending, devoid of death's reprieve. What say thee, adagium? The war god's words echoed in his mind, merciless and cruel. Everything that had befallen him and had been Somnus's fault. He'd been so sure of it. It was the crowning achievement of his brother's cunning, carried on by generations of his successors, a scheme that robbed him and Era of their happiness and future. It had cheated them of everything, even their purpose in life. But now the truth was laid bare. The trap had been set not by Somnus, but the Draconian. Lift the lid on the chessman's case, and Somnus lay there too, another pitiful pawn in the god's cruel game. The fate bestowed upon a man cannot be changed. Now go, fulfill thy calling. Not once have I begged the gods for such a blessing, and I do not intend to kneel before you now. Ardyn summoned his own blades and flung them at Bahamut. When the weapon points connected with the god's giant form, Ardyn infused them with demonic fury. But all his assault managed was a tiny scratch across the giant masked face. Thine impudence shall prove thine undoing, foolish mortal. Pitiful creature. By the time Ardyn was conscious of the counterattack, it had already landed, and his body was hurtling backward. He could not move to retaliate. Pain seared through him as the war god's great blades lanced deep into his arms and legs. It was not a physical pain alone. Ardyn had felt anguish like this once before, in the sanctuary with Somnus, when his brother and countrymen had thrust their weapons into him. The Draconian's assault brought these feelings back, this time with relentless, deep intensity many times beyond what he'd suffered at Somnus's hands. Each wound burned with agony as it opened his flesh. If thou wilt fight against fate, so shall it be. His vision blurred with the torment. A pale figure appeared before him. The pure white, immaculate garment seemed familiar, as did the hair with its faint gold luster. He then saw that it was Era, and she bore the trident in her hands. "Ghosts do not but haunt my tortured soul," he whispered. It was an illusion of the war god's making. He would not be fooled. Once Era was lost, he'd brought her face to mind again and again, desperate not to lose its details. Every little mannerism, every movement, every sound of her voice. He'd recounted every minute thing about her until it was all etched in his memory forever. No illusion could fool him. The woman before him was not Era. "Enough of this," he gasped between bolts of pain. Era stepped near. The trident of the oracle was before him. The woman's expression was flat. The threat was clear. Obey, or lose everything. "If this is the fate you thrust upon me, I shall see it back to you," he said. Era stared at him with cold, unfeeling eyes. "I will not The trident pierced his bowels. He screamed as he was visited by agony anew, one that was far greater than any real pain. His breath caught in his throat. Between thrusts he saw blood black as night dripping from the tines. He knew in his mind that this, too, was an illusion. Era, the trident, the spilling blood, and all the agony he felt. They were all conjured by the Draconian. But his mind could not push them away. "Pierce my heart if you must, but you will never kill my resolve." He told himself that the pain was nothing, that he would not succumb to the god's foul tactics. He would no longer be toyed with. What was another eternity in darkness when he'd endured one already? "The path men tread was never meant for me," he growled, and suddenly he was filled with a ferocious strength. He raged like a beast, a monster, and the blades lodged in his limbs snapped and broke to pieces. His spectral arms again spread around him, and he cut the false Era to the ground. "Doth man know no recourse but the blade? Return to thy world. Embrace thy suffering." The space at his feet shattered, and he was falling with no end in sight. Where am I? The world was murky and gray. He knew not whether he'd spent only a moment in that strange emptiness or an eternity. Am I alive? Does it matter? Perhaps not. There was something familiar about this place. When he strained his eyes, he could make out the stone walls, the cramped space, the broken shackles and rent chains on the floor below. It was Angelgard, the cell. Nothing matters, none of it. Not the blessed gods above, nor the accursed kings below. To hell with them all! He stood. Unlike the day of his discovery by Verstale, his limbs felt strong and sure. The way to the surface still gaped open, and Ardyn's step did not waver as he made his way out. All that matters is that I have my revenge. No longer would he bow to the whims of others. He would be the master, and all others his puppets. He'd toy with them, more cunning and cruel than even the gods. I will spread this scourge across the earth, lure out this king of light, and kill him. Then the entire world of Eos shall be drenched in darkness and despair for time eternal. It was not enough for Somnus alone to suffer. There were others upon whom vengeance must be wrought. And then I shall fell the gods. In time, the day would come. He would tear off Bahamut's mask, break his swords, and see him crawl across the ground in shame. The gods would bear the greatest humiliation they could ever know. No matter how many decades or centuries might pass, what eons beyond imagining might be needed to draw his plan together, he would see it done and executed. That alone he vowed to himself. And for the first time in 2 long millennia, Ardyn felt truly fortunate to have a body that would not know death. ME 736. Noctis Lucis Caelum is born. ME 741. Crown Prince Noctis, heir apparent to the throne of Lucis, is revealed as the true king. His face is known to Ardyn, seen in the vision shared by Bahamut 7 years ago, in which Regis, to whom the revelations was delivered by the kings of yore, holds the small boy in his arms. The child's face bears an unmistakable similarity to that of Somnus. The same picture-perfect scene is undoubtedly cherished by all throughout the Citadel. Regis establishes the King's Glaive, a reformed royal guard serve under his direct command and ensure the safety of the chosen king. He's getting hung up on chosen in the line underneath. All continues to proceed according to fate, or rather, the will of the Draconian. ME 745. Shiva, the Glacian, awakens in the Gahorovus Rift, in the region of, I think it was Vogliupe. I took Latin, I swear to God I did. It was in junior high. She begins an assault on Niflheim, engaging with the Imperial forces at their border. Niflheim is ultimately victorious, but at the cost of the greater part of their military forces. For Ardyn, the goddess's attack is an unexpected stroke of providence. He had been gently prodding Verstael along a new line of research, in hopes of creating a new type of demon-infused magic technology tailored for engagements against the gods. The encounter with Shiva provides a perfect opportunity to test and confirm the weapon's efficiency. Whether similar results might be expected against the Draconian, none can say. Still, the progress made is undeniable. ME 755. A ceasefire is declared between Niflheim and Lucis. Ardyn visits Lucis personally to negotiate the end to hostilities. The Regis he encounters there, 21 years after their last meeting, looks astonishingly haggard and gray for his age. His efforts to stay the Imperial incursion by way of sustaining the wall and the city's other defenses seem to have taken a great toll upon him. ME 756. Insomnia falls. The Niflheim Empire's plan goes off without a hitch. The day before the invasion, Ardyn enjoys a first encounter with Prince Noctis at Galden Quay. Seen in the flesh, the young prince is the spitting image of Somnus. So close is their appearance that Ardyn is filled with zeal anew. He is determined to see the boy suffer in every conceivable manner before his ascension as true king and ultimate demise. Later that year, Noctis is pulled in by the crystal and begins his true awakening as the chosen king. ME 766. The crowned city was shrouded in darkness, covered in night like every other corner of the star. Oh, how long it had been, and how curious it should have felt long at all. 32 years since the Draconian's decree. 32 years since the discovery that incomprehensible destiny thrust upon him. After 2 millennia in that cursed stone cell, those years should have felt like a brief moment, passed with hardly a notice. Instead, they had dragged on, a weight of unbearable length. Once the day was gone, and the world knew only night, the areas surrounding the citadel were a place where demons lurked and men dared not draw near. There, upon the throne now claimed as his own, Ardyn waited with a singular purpose, ever eager to receive the man bearing the crystal's blessing and title of true king. "Do hurry, Noct," was his constant wish. "I am ever so anxious to see you again." Thus Ardyn sat in unwavering desire, waiting for the one fated to approach his throne. When the day finally came, and the doors were pushed wide by hands wearied beyond their years, he knew precisely how he'd begin. "I'm afraid you're out of luck." The observation was not true only for the guest, but for the speaker, too. "The one you hope to see," Ardyn continued, "is not here." "Nor is the one I wish to see," he added, though not aloud. The visitor before him was not the one he had long awaited. This was something quite different from the reunion that the god of war had promised. A laugh Ardyn could not suppress rose from his chest. It seemed that the gods could not dictate the future with precision that they claimed. Either that or the fate they decreed had gone off course. It was a reunion that could be not explained in any other way. "Ah, but do pardon my surprise," he said, "at this most unexpected development." There she stood, in defiance of death. A death of which he was certain, for it had come at his own hands, that day in Altissia. "How very nice it is to see you again, Lady Lunafreya." That is the end of A Savior Lost. So, for those of you listening on YouTube, big ol' fucking plot twist. And next time will be episode Aranea, the beginning of the end. So, for those of you on YouTube, thank you so much for listening. And I will see you guys next time. Take it easy.